Hello, and welcome back to Tidbit of Torah. On Monday, my husband and I took our little daughter Maytal caving for the first time. And we didn't just go by day, but we took a UV flashlight tour of the caves in Manitou Springs by night. And one of the things that was so cool as we were winding through the stalagmites and the stalactites was appreciating how much space light takes up. The light of our flashlights was illuminating all the minerals and nooks and crannies within the cave. I appreciated this especially when our guide told us to turn off our flashlights and we stood for several minutes in the pitch black of the cave at night. All of us know people in our lives who take up too much space and others who we wish would take up more space at our times. And this tension about how much space each person takes up is at the core of this week's Torah portion, Parshat Korach. When Korach steps in along with his band of followers and he says to Moses, Rav lechem, you have gone too far. Don't you know that all the community are holy? Why do you raise yourselves above the people of the congregation? How does Moses respond? He literally falls on his face. And we see this big contrast between Korach, who comes in with a sense of confidence and even arrogance, in direct contrast to Moses, who is a man of humility, a nav meod. We hear the tradition calling Moses in the Torah several times. He is very humble, in other words. Well, this tension about what is going on with Korach raises a lot of questions over the centuries with the rabbis. What was it that Korach did so wrong? Aren't all people, after all, holy? Well, the rabbis weigh in across time. And what are some of the reasons they say? Well, some say that this idea of holiness is not one that we can just all be. We actually have to do actions to be holy. And so in that sense, maybe Korach was wrong. He misunderstood what it means to be holy. It actually means to do holy. Others say that Korach's argument, while fundamentally there was some underpinnings of democratic ideas that made sense, the way he presented it was an argument that wasn't for the sake of heaven. In other words, Korach was trying to promote himself. He was coming from a place of arrogance, whereas Moses, in contrast, was actually one about service to God. He was a sort of servant and to God's leadership, and there was a contrast there, as tradition says, between those that argue like Korach and those that argue like the house of Hillel, whose really arguments were for the sake of heaven. Rambam, the medieval thinker, says that humility comes on a spectrum. That on either end, we want to avoid. On one end, we have self-debasement, and on the other hand, we have arrogance. And we want to avoid those poles. It's actually the middle where we find humility and pride that we want to occupy. And that depending on the situation, we might move along this spectrum. At times, we need to take up a little more space. And at other times, we need to take up a little less space. But ultimately, humility is connected to a sense of self-esteem. That to live in a total way of denying oneself and being insecure is not the ideal, nor is it to be like Korach and to come from a place of arrogance, but to be able to read a situation and know how to show up with a sense of self-assurance, but also with humility, ultimately allows us to be in service of others and a community, and ultimately of God. To be in many ways like that light, which illuminates all that's around us, not for the sake of itself, but for the sake of lighting up the journey ahead for those around us. I want to wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and may we all be able to navigate that space with curiosity, with humility, and also with pride and confidence, all at the same time as we chart the way forward.